Well, thank you for a very inspiring bit of information. My question for you is, one of the things that we struggle with here is, I want to call it educating the sector, and that sounds very, very broad, but how do we help organizations from an educational perspective deal with some of the things that you're talking about in relation to financing versus funding, for example, these kind of bigger, more complex issues?
I can point to the experience that we have in the UK, because this is very much, I suppose, about the capacity building type work that Ncvo does. I think, first of all, we're always on the lookout for champions, and if we can find examples of where that is taking place already. There's increasing use of action learning sets in the UK, where instead of us doing the sort of the chalk and talk type stuff at the beginning, we try and bring people together who are all trying to work through the same problem at the same time. The language issue, as I highlighted, I think is a particular problem. So what we've just tried to produce is a sort of, what we would call a Janet and John guide to social finance that has a very clear glossary of what all the different terms are that are being used. I think we also have to recognise that some of this isn't necessarily about educating our constituency, it's about educating the people, the stakeholders that we're actually trying to work with. I think sometimes they have an attitude that's build it and they will come, that it's so self-evidently wonderful that what they have, that why wouldn't you want to get involved in it? Well, actually, that's not true. So it's about educating them as well. And then finally, and this potentially is a broader issue for you in terms of capacity building and educating the sector, we're finding that our resources are increasingly constrained there. But also we're finding that the internet is changing attitudes, and that increasingly people don't always want to be told what to do. They want to be recommended what to do by their colleagues and friends already. So we are trying to think about how we use the web and other new technology so that we can connect people together around these issues. And it's peer-to-peer support that is actually helping people get through and understand these issues rather than us at the centre. So there's a fantastic phrase that some of those militant optimists use, which is convene, curate, create. So what we're thinking about is that we don't just have a role as creators anymore. Actually, some of our biggest way that we can change the world is by convening and curating some of the things that are happening elsewhere already.
Thank you, Karl. Really interesting. I'm under the impression that the UK government is adopting a value for money approach to evaluation, and given that one of the themes of this conference is assessing impact, I'd be very curious to know what the implications of that value for money evaluation model has had on the nonprofit sector, because the Canadian government is already using the phrase, the federal government is already using the phrase, but they're interpreting it slightly differently, and my understanding is they're watching what's happening in the UK to see whether or not they should adopt the same model.
The holy grail that we've been all seeking for the last 15 years is how do we measure outcomes? And now it's how do we measure outcomes specifically in relation to value for money. There's been an awful lot of interest in a mechanism called social return on investment, where outcomes from organisations, whether you're working with children and young people or whether you're working with animals, everything ultimately is monetised. It's influenced by the healthcare field, where they use something called quality life years adjusted, or QALYs, for trying to understand the role of different medical interventions. The implications so far, well, first of all, let me challenge you with quite a difficult implication. Are we not as good as we think we are? Because I think one of the implications of some of these measures is that we think the interventions that we think we're making that are effective actually might turn out to be not effective. I think a second implication is that organisations continue to desperately struggle with outcomes measurement, and I think I think the implication is that some organisations will fail in the system, not because they don't deliver good outcomes, but because they can't demonstrate the value of those outcomes. So my apologies if this is a little bit negative, but one of the implications of things like a shift to value for money is that you move to ever larger and larger organisations that have the back office in place to be able to contract. And this is scale is, again, possibly something that we keep coming back to, but there's a worry that, contrary to the ideals of the big society, that public service delivery is increasingly going to be a minority sport played by a relatively small number of very big organisations, and even our biggest charities are too small for that. I suppose a final positive about the shift to this value for money approach is that it is making organisations focus on outcomes. And I know that sounds like a rather silly thing to say to this audience, but focusing on outcomes is not something that everybody does.
Yeah, thank you for many very interesting ideas and connecting the dots in a context that has many implications for us as well. I want to follow a little bit further on that similar theme, the social impact bond, which was very interesting. And I'm interested to hear your thoughts on what impact is that having in terms of people's view of monitoring evaluation. I'm an advocate of participatory monitoring and evaluation, encouraging and enabling people to monitor and evaluate their own programs for the value of strategic planning, organizational change, improving things, and then also for attracting support from other organizations. So you said this is an initial study that's going on. I'd be interested to hear a little bit more what's going in that, and what do you see as the implications of that? What effects will that have on the voluntary sector, the whole social impact bond idea and related topics?
I'm going to try and split my response into two parts, specifically about measurement issues and then about social finance. My understanding of how that's progressing so far in terms of the measurement issues is that this, I think first of all, it's highlighted that measuring outcomes is a huge problem that we're all struggling with, not just voluntary organisations, government as well. It's highlighting that the quality of the evidence that we need to meet the sort of to meet the standards of evidence that Treasury wants so that it would actually pay out, that the standards of evidence are much higher than what many organisations are able to deliver already, because I think we're almost moving in the direction of randomised control trials, of social experiments where you have control groups in the field and you can directly compare your intervention with the group that you are working with a control group who don't receive the same intervention. By the way, on that issue, there's a really interesting blogger, again from the US, called Sean Stannard Stockton, who writes a blog called Tactical Philanthropy. Sean's written before around the use of evidence here, and I'd encourage you to look at that. I think what some wiser people are beginning to say is that actually this isn't something that we're going to solve in the next 2 years or the next 3 years. This is quite possibly an agenda that's going to take 20 years to sort out. We're having similar discussions actually about the measurement of well-being and happiness in the UK at the minute, and people are highlighting that the GDP measure that everybody just takes for granted took decades to get right, and I think it's the same for measurement. I think in terms of what the impact is on approaches like participatory measurement, I think ultimately we have a paradigm that is dominated by quantification, and I think these new, well not new, but these sorts of approaches I think potentially are going to not just edge out approaches like participatory evaluation. I think my concern is that they also edge out other approaches to demonstrating impact like storytelling. I think actually we haven't invested enough time and resources in trying to develop storytelling and narrative as ways to demonstrate impact. One of our biggest foundations or funders in the UK is something called the Big Lottery Fund. For a number of years recently, has had something called SMART outcomes, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, targeted. And the SMART outcomes approach has dominated their monitoring and evaluation. But actually, just recently, they've been experimenting with some small organisations, and they've just cut all that completely, and they've actually shifted to blogging. And what they've said to those community projects is, don't fill out these complex monitoring and evaluation forms, just blog about what you've achieved today, and use that narrative instead. And I think that's interesting, and we should hold on to that. In terms of the implications in terms of the, social finance more generally, I'm very much of the opinion at the minute that social finance is an approach that can be taken up by relatively few organisations. My concern is that social finance is seen as a silver bullet, and that somehow we will no longer need grants because social finance will replace them. So we're very much of the view at the minute that what we need is what I mentioned before. It's that diverse ecosystem of funding and finance where grants have a role and social finance has a role. I think where we've led ourselves down as a sector, and you might feel the same about this in Canada, I don't think we have a good enough mental map of what funding and finance mechanisms are appropriate at what stages of an organisation's life cycle, for what subsectors, for example, at what times. I think we need to use our resources much more effectively so that A, resources go to where they're most needed, and not, as Peter Elson suggested to me yesterday, where they are most wanted. And secondly, we need to get much better at mapping the way resources go to an organisation with the type of intervention that they're supporting. So, in some cases, randomised control trials with payment by results, it seems to me actually may be very appropriate, where you have a very clear intervention, a very clear population, and an outcome that's relatively straightforward to measure. But in some other areas where we're trying to deliver policy outcomes across a range of silos, those sorts of approaches are wholly inappropriate.
Karl, you mentioned in your slide the reduction in infrastructure, and I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little bit more. And also, Ncvo is such an outstanding infrastructure organization in the UK. I know one of the things that we're concerned about, and we see at a national level, is the loss of some of the infrastructure organizations that had emerged and started to play a very significant role over the last decade. And we're now starting to see some of that being challenged. And so I wonder if you could also speak to the impact of this changing environment on Ncvo and its role.
I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think infrastructure organisations are important, whether you call them umbrella bodies or infrastructure. But I think we lost our way a little bit as a sector. And one of the threats that you might be familiar with is that we all think we're unique. And because we all think we're unique, we think we all need our own very specific umbrella body. And what we tend to do as a sector is that we, instead of celebrating diversity, we focus on uniqueness and we focus on differences rather than how that diversity can strengthen us. And as a result, we have too much infrastructure. And some of that is disappearing and shrinking. Just to explain our own, and this is how the big society is affecting us. Up until recently, we had a core grant from government every year of £1 million, about, what's that, about 1.6 or 1.7 million Canadian dollars. That's been reduced to £500,000 last year. It's £350,000 this year, and in 2 years' time, it will be zero. Yes. And I think one of the things that, first of all, that highlights to me is that you have a responsibility as the members, and if you're not members, you should be members of CCVO. This is your infrastructure organisation, and it's down to you to support it. I think the second thing that it highlights for me is that we are having to move to much more a social enterprise stroke market model, where some of that education that I talked about just before, we can't, which I actually think are public goods, we can't give those away as much as we wanted to, and we're going to have to start charging for that. So the implications for us is, have we not just got the systems in place to move to that model, but actually have we got the culture? And are you ready, as the users of these services, are you ready to pay for them? So do you have to change your mindset as well? I'm very conscious that some of the things that I do around policy, research, advocacy, I mean, they're public goods. The advocacy work that I do in terms of influencing government about the tax system, I can't point to a particular person in the audience and say, $20 worth of that is yours. I'll send you an invoice at the end of the month. So again, I think we have to think about the bigger picture as members of infrastructure organisations and think that we're better together, and therefore it's an investment. The other thing that I would also highlight that worries me a little bit about the UK is that we tend to see infrastructure organisations as well, essentially as business services providers. And we think that infrastructure is about voluntary sector management, that it's about helping you improve your governance, for example. It's about helping you think about new ways of earning or new ways of funding. And that is absolutely a critical point of what we do. But we also build your capacity, I would argue, by lobbying and influencing on your behalf. So we've got to make sure that we get all the different bits right. It's a much tougher future for Ncvo. I mean, much tougher for, say, me to come over and speak at things like this, and I think that will be a bad thing if we can't do that. But one of the good things I wonder about going forward is that as government reduces its funding and then ends its funding for infrastructure organisations, does that make us much, much more focused on what you need as organisations?